Welcome everyone to our Quilts equals Art equals Quilts Artist Talk. I'm Davana Robedee at the Schweinfurth Art Center. I'm joined today with Kathy Nida from El Cajon, California. Kathy is an artist who's been in our Quilts equals Art equals Quilts exhibit for a while now in different years. I'm really excited to talk to her. Hi Kathy, how's it going?
It's going. We've got great weather here, so I'm good.
Yeah, that's great. So the piece we have on display right now is Swallow Me Whole. Do you want to talk a little bit about what's going on there?
Sure. It started as a drawing in a staff meeting. I should clarify that I'm a middle school teacher and I hate staff meetings, and so I draw through them because otherwise I fall asleep. And it helps me concentrate. So those of you who do draw or do art stuff, you know that in really boring times, they help. And I had started drawing this head, and then my boss kept saying, you have to do this and you have to do this. And I drew a head swallowing the head because I felt like I was being swallowed by something. And I was like, well, I need to make this like more. Like the people around me, they always watch me and they're like, can you get more heads in there? And of course the paper wasn't big enough. So I went to a bigger piece of paper, and it took me about 4 or 5 tries to get 5 heads in there. And I'm still like, how can I get more? But you know, every time you make a head, it's got to be bigger. But it's this feeling of like you're being swallowed, of like the anxiety, like there's this core person inside you. And like, here's the one that's in charge of your job. And here's the one that's in charge of why haven't you cleaned the house? And here's the one in charge of how do you pay the bills? And it was just like this, felt like I was being swallowed, and I just kept making it as big as I could. And all the different heads have sort of a personality to them.
I feel like anxiety is a common theme in your work. Do
Yeah,
you,
probably.
do you see that?
Well, you know, a lot of my work comes out of me personally. And certainly right now I've done 2 COVID quilts, and I thought that was it. And then I drew a third one and I'm like, I guess I'm not done with this. And of course everybody's like, well, how can you be done? It's still going. So, you know, and I focus on the things I'm worried about: women's rights, women's issues in general. I have a quilt I did about guns in schools, because that's a pretty big concern. Climate change, as a science teacher, and well, now I'm an art teacher too, which is a little weird. Well, maybe not because I'm an artist, but you know, as a science teacher, there's all these things that I'm constantly worrying about. And being a teacher of middle schoolers, I'm also worried. So, and I probably just naturally am kind of an anxious, worried person, and art is how I get it out of my system and onto something else.
So I really like your work. I've actually been a fan of it for a while now, and I always enjoy having it at the Schweinfurth. And it's interesting to see people's reaction to your pieces, because they're difficult. You know, a lot of people are interested in making like pretty art, and I'm not saying your work isn't beautiful, but they're deal with difficult topics. Your figures are often going through sort of physically torturous looking experiences. There's dark subject matter. How are you mining that material, and where are you getting that inspiration?
Well, you know, I've had people say before, like, what were you thinking about when you drew this? And I'm like I just kind of let my head spill out onto the paper, and sometimes it makes more sense than others. So it might be something, you know, I might be watching the news, which I try not to do. It might be, sometimes it's somebody that sent me an email and it's a personal thing and I just don't know what to do with it. And so I'm drawing that. And then I use a lot of imagery. And so I know, especially with some of the bigger quilts, that people will stand and stare at them for just ages trying to figure out. And they're like, what does this mean? And what does this mean? And what does that mean? And I'm like, you know, what do you think it means? Like when you're looking at it, what are you getting out of it? Like I know some of what I was thinking about when I drew it. And that's where I start, is with the drawing. And that's where, you know, all the idea part comes into the drawing part, and the whole quilt making part is, you know, that's a whole nother process. But I'm not necessarily always, like when I did the gun control quilt, I was very much, I'm a teacher. This is what it feels like to be in a classroom when you guys won't get rid of guns. And when I have to get 35 kids into a corner, 35 12-year-olds into a corner and silent. And half my students are refugees from war-torn countries and they cry. So to me, that was a very much, how do I put that in a quilt? And I still don't know if it was successful, but a lot of times I just draw, and like if if somebody says, stand up in front of this and explain it, I'm like, okay, I'm going to try, but it's a lot about what's in here and just sort of spilling, like I call it a brain dump.
Yeah.
I'm not really thinking, hey, what's this eyeball going to look like? I just draw the eyeball. And then people are like, oh, you did it because of this. And I'm like, all right, okay. I mean, it's their personal experience with it. I've listened to some people talk about my work and I went, really? Okay. I can see that, but that's them bringing their personal experience to it, which is what I think art should do.
You talk a little bit about subconscious nature that like connects you to drawings and where you're allowing the imagery to just happen. And you talk about, using dreams as inspiration.
Yeah, my dreams aren't always good. But also, like, when I'm in the car and driving places, I have some of my best ideas. And I've always said, like, the person that can make a device where I can just like hold my phone to my head and it downloads the picture in there so that I don't have to then go home and go, okay, wait a minute, how did I draw that? And then I have 5 different versions before I can get it out of my head. That would be awesome, because a lot of I'll wake up with an image in my head and it will stick with me all day. And because I'm a teacher, I can't like stop what I'm doing and draw it. I might write some notes down, but then it might be 3 days to 2 weeks before I can sit down and draw whatever it is that poked me in the head in the middle of the night, or when I was, listening to a student say something, or in the middle of a staff meeting. Because I really do think I've got like this art brain, as opposed to the brain that deals with the dishes and everything else. And it's constantly sitting there going, and it's like, hey, what about this? Hey, what if you did that? Like, even when I went and looked up which quilt it was in this show, and I'm like, oh yeah, the swallowing heads. I wonder if I can get more heads in this picture. Like, I could go bigger. And that quilt is huge, man. I don't know that I can go bigger, but I could start smaller. Because that was one of the challenges, is trying to get as many heads in that picture as possible, just because we are so bombarded. So,
Well, the interesting thing about your big quilts, and I really think everybody should come out if you can in person and see her pieces, because the imagery does not do them justice. There's large, but they're small in that the pieces you are working with you can have a whole scene in a space of this big, where you have these bigger heads, but inside of the bodies there are these other things going on. And
I need to stop making such small things inside the big things. And I'm like, well, that's how my brain works. It's like, it works in this little tiny, it's like Dr. Seuss, like, how do I fit more things in there, or Richard Scarry, that's the one where you'd stare at the page and you're like, oh, look, there's a pig over there. And my brain is just like, you can't leave anything blank. You got to keep filling it in.
How you go from a sketch to the final piece. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about how that happens, just process wise?
So I draw a lot, and I find one that I want to make into a quilt, and I usually enlarge it, because otherwise I really do have some super tiny pieces. But even when I enlarge it, then I'm like, oh, well, this arm needs to keep going. So then I'll add paper to it and draw some more. And so I totally destroy that process of trying not to draw too small. And then that is my pattern. And so some of my quilts have 2,000-3,000 pieces in them. And I'm crazy and I number them all. And I use a fusible web. So I trace every single piece on a fusible web, iron it to fabric, cut them all out, and then I put them back together on the drawing with a Teflon sheet, like I'm doing a puzzle, quite honestly. So most of the creativity, like what you would consider the art part of it, is in the drawing and then in choosing color. And so a lot of people are like, oh, they color it out beforehand or whatever. And I don't. I color it in my head. And this is where people are like, you do what? So I just hang the drawing. Actually, I hang it on that wall behind me right there. And I stare at it and I go, well, what, in my head, I'm like, what if it was light blue? What if it was turquoise? And sometimes I hold pieces of fabric next to each other. But it's all basically coloring in my head. And it's a very relaxing and meditative process. But otherwise, then I end up making a quilt just like everybody else does. I stitch it down, I sandwich it, on the floor like a crazy woman. And then I, quilt it and bind it just like you would a regular quilt. So I was trained in the basic, quilt processes. I just didn't like doing it that way.
Yeah. Why a quilt? Because you talk about like you make the drawing, you blow the drawing up, and I mean, it could just be a drawing, but then you go this extra insane step
Yeah.
of,
I used to be a printmaker. I did screen prints. And I was at the same time learning how to quilt. I learned how to sew when I was 7 or 8 years old. My mom taught me to sew my clothes, which is so hysterical now that I think about it. But so I knew how to sew. And so I was kind of surrounded by fabric. And it has a very tactile quality to it. I did go to art school. I have an art degree, but I'm not much of a painter. I mean, I can do it, but I don't really enjoy it. And so I started with printmaking, which I did. I enjoyed the graphic, like blocks of color that you would, you would separate out like that. But when I got pregnant with my kids, you cannot, first of all, you can't use chemicals that are going to be dangerous to a child that's either developing or you're nursing or whatever. Second of all, like you need to have the time to make the screen, to pull the prints, to clean the screen before you destroy it. And it was like hours of time I didn't have. Whereas I was like, at the same time, I was learning how to quilt and I was doing hand applique, which takes forever. And I'm like, yeah, but I can actually nurse a baby and hand applique at the same time. And I can put it down when I need to deal with baby, and then I can pick it up again. And it's not, that's a process I can continue to do even though I have small children. This was a way that I could take those graphic images and make them into something that to me, then it has that 3D quality to it as well. When you quilt, you get that three-dimensional stuff that I like. And I actually really like the palette. Like, people make fabric and I'm like, oh, I can use this. It's like I have this never-ending palette that I don't have to mix. I don't have to try and remember how to make flesh colors because I can just go in my flesh colored drawer and go, okay, this, and this. So I could blame my mom for making me sew my clothes or the kids being born or whatever, but it worked. So I kept doing it.
But there's something conceptual going on with the connection to dreams, the connection to the subconscious, this sort of difficult material than being presented on what could be called a blanket or, the soft.
Women's work.
Yeah, it does. It goes back to that women's work, but I do think there's a tension that meets there for your work.
And it's a tension that actually, I mean, I appreciate it. I have a great grandmother, I think. I have to remember how far back gone. That I have this book of Mormon quilts, and she's my great grandmother that made quilts, and I have quilts that were handed down to me. And my mom was a weaver, so we always had this attachment to fiber. But yeah, I actually have a really hard time because my imagery tends to be difficult. I have a hard time in quilt shows because they're like, oh, we don't want that in our quilt show because it's supposed to be pretty or nice or amazingly put together or whatever. But then I have a hard time in art shows because they're like, oh, that's a quilt. And you're like, okay, well, I'm not, and people are like, did you choose to make it more difficult? And I'm like, I didn't. But now that it is, y'all can you can put them in the quilt shows and you can put them in the art shows because they belong there. If I painted it, I actually think it would be more flat. It wouldn't have the same depth that it does now. So I think the techniques I use and the materials I use are part of, people are like, oh, it's a quilt. We're going to go up and it's going to be a quilt, like a blanket, and it goes on the bed. And then they're like, oh, wait a minute. What is this? Wow. What is she? And then they get either mad or happy or excited or whatever, which is fine. But I kind of like it now. I didn't plan it. It just happened. But, and I do get, I get irritated sometimes. I'm like, why can't you have this in your show? It's a piece of art. Or this is a quilt. You need to open your views a little bit more. So
in the past, I know that some people have gotten very angry about some of your pieces.
yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about how people react and why do you think they have such an intense anger at your work? Because
I've been told that if I lived in Europe that nobody would care about the nudity. And I don't know if I don't live in Europe, I live here. I've had quilts that needed to be covered up because they showed women's parts. And I never think about the nudity. I never think I'm going to make it nude. I'm a science teacher. I'm like, what's inside the body? What's outside the body? When you put clothes on someone, it tells you something about that person. But if you're just looking at, like, a lot of mine are earth mothers. And so to me, it's like they are the embodiment of earth and everything that's going on. Why would I put clothes on them? But I also come out of this fine art, I have a fine arts degree. So we drew nude models, and it was not an issue. And like, if I painted them, would that be okay? So, and for me, it's like, if I don't like what's on a quilt, I just walk past it. And so, unfortunately, a lot of the people that don't like my stuff, they can't just walk past it. They have to call Fox News. So I had one that was in a traveling quilt show, and it was one of the Mancuso brothers shows, and they were very good. I mean, they eventually put it behind a curtain and like covered up the vulva part. And I'm like, really? And I made the news for that one. That was a fun one. And then I had another one that was pulled because they said that a woman came to the show and said she saw a penis in it. There's no penis in it. I know this because I made it. And trust me, I've made quilts with penises in them. And if there's a penis in it, you're going to know about it. And so it's just, and I've had times where people have said, can you make a quilt without all that? And sometimes I do. I have a piece called Earth Mother for Ventura that is beautiful, that has no nudity in it. And it sold pretty quickly. And then I kind of got like, I felt like I didn't feel comfortable making it because, like, I purposely was covering up things that normally I don't think about covering up. I don't think that there's anything wrong with breasts or babies on breasts or the vulva, or penises, though they do look weird sometimes, but that's okay, So I realize the people that are looking at mine and getting upset about it are like, well, why does she need to do that? And it's just because that's the core of who we are. We don't come into this world with clothes on. I could put different clothes on than what I'm wearing right now, and you would look at me differently. I don't want you to do that. I want you to look at the core of this human and what they're going through. I do sometimes put clothes on them, but then there's a reason for it. So I've had quilts pulled from shows, and I do get a lot of support. So in the long run, I'm like, well, so, I had 20,000 hits on my blog in like 1 week, and I kind of went, okay. And I call my union rep at school because I'm a teacher. I have a morality clause, and I'm like, as far as I'm concerned, I'm fine. And the lawyers say I'm fine, but it does worry me sometimes. I don't tell my students that I'm an exhibiting artist, which it's sad that I can't do that. They know that I draw, but I can't tell them, even now that I'm teaching art, that I exhibit art, because if they went to look at it and their parents got upset, I could lose my job.
I never thought of it from that angle for you. That is so frustrating.
It is.
To shift gears for a moment, I want to talk about a little bit you addressed in your response, the Mother Gia, and a lot of your figures have this intense relationship to the earth, are female figures. Can you talk a little bit about how those figures are interacting with their environment and what's going on with that thought process?
I've always drawn women, even when I was like in college, because when you're a woman, like, you're constantly either trying not to get pregnant or trying to get pregnant or dealing with, on either side of it, all the stuff that goes with it. And when I was younger, it was really annoying to have to deal with all that. And so, I mean, I am a woman. I identify as a woman. I don't, most of what I make comes out of who I am and what I'm dealing with. And at some point in time, you want to fix everything. And especially when you're a mom and a teacher of teenagers, there's a lot of things out there that you want to fix. And I kind of think of, I'm not a religious person, so the concept of a God isn't going to help me with that. But like this concept of there being a Mother Earth, of something that's trying to take care of all of us, that's something that we also need to take care of. I kind of like this figure, like with the most recent coronavirus ones, like there's this mother who's caring for us and giving to us and trying to, and we're not doing a very good job of taking care of her, honestly, and we should be doing a better job. So I kind of think of these sort of archetypical women folks, because I think of us as more of, and some of this is society, nature versus nurture kind of stuff, but we're trying to fix and take care of more than, I look at sort of a male tendency to like, fight and that. And I'm not looking at that. I'm looking more at how do we take care of everything around us. And so for me, that ends up being a female figure, a mother Earth type figure, in a lot of my work.
You have this really intensive work process. What is a day like in your studio? I mean, how much time do you spend in there? It's got to be insane.
So I also spread out all over the house. So you're missing the 3 by 4 foot light table that's in the other room, that I got from somebody who did stained glass. And that was just a matter of I'm a single mom and I had to raise kids, and so I had to be able to work wherever I was. And so this is the studio I spend most of my art time in, as well as the place where I do a lot of my school stuff in. So, um, you know, I always look at my brain and it's sort of, half creative and half logical. And plenty of people in my life will argue the logic part, but it likes to have control over certain parts of the processes, which is why I number all those pieces and then I sort them into bins by hundreds, because it makes it easier for me to get to the part where I'm choosing fabric or whatever, and I get to be in that meditative art brain instead of the I need to have control over this piece. And that's the way my whole life is. It's like, with school, I'm going to have control over this piece of grading and the lesson planning, and it is going to stop. I mean, it's been hard with the pandemic and online teaching, but I need to have time at the end of the day. And my goal has always been spend an hour a day making art. And sometimes that turns into 2 or 3 hours, but that's after, an 8 to 10, well, at the moment, 12, 14-hour day of working school. And then I try to give myself weekends and holidays as well to make art. But like somebody asked me yesterday, how much time a year? And I'm like, well, I actually track my time. It's how I price my stuff. But from a year from today back, I've only spent about 600 hours making art. And my job has taken way more than that. But the year before it was almost 800 hours. So I don't, people are like, how do you get so much done? And I'm like, because the art is what drives me. Like if I don't make art the next day, I feel like I didn't do something right. So even if it's just sit down and cut out a bunch of pieces of fabric and make some weird face, then that's what I'm going to do. So it is a significant drive to keep me sane. But I have a need to produce.
What's next? What are your new ideas? What's in the sketchbook? What's on the sewing table?
Well, so I just I found a drawing from July that I had almost finished. That's another COVID drawing, and it's another sort of Earth Mothery type one. And I finished it, and I went and enlarged it, and I taped it together last night, and I'm still staring at it because I also know I have a friend's partner who is putting a show together about childbirth and asked me if I would if I could share some of my work. And I'm like, yeah. And then I started to think, like, a lot of my work has childbirth in it, but it isn't necessarily about childbirth alone. And the ones that have sold. So I'm like, I really should be making something for that. But like, it's really hard not to just be COVID, COVID, COVID all the time. Because it is the biggest anxiety over all of us. And like for me, I can't go back to school in person until there's a vaccine or something, because I'm one of those sweet high risk people. So it's driving me crazy not to be able to go to school and see kids in person and talk to other teachers. But like, this is my daily existence. Why am I doing this? Well, because pandemic. So I don't know which I'm going to do next. I'm still debating. I also have a smaller one that I found, another staff meeting drawing. I do a lot of drawings in staff meetings, and it's just real small and simple. And I'm like, maybe that's like a palette cleanser. I just finished a pretty complicated one about COVID. Maybe I just need a short little boom. And that's actually, it says on it, boom. And then by then I'll have made a decision if I'm going to do childbirth or whether I'm going to do the other COVID one that is sitting. It's all ready. It's ready to go. It's in there. I finished one quilt like last Thursday. I went camping last weekend. And I already have one ready to go. And that's how I need to work in order to stay sane.
Yeah. Is there anything that I haven't picked up on or I missed, or anything important that you want to say about your work?
Only that I appreciate that you guys will show it, because a lot of my stuff needs to be on those big walls. And when I went and watched the tour, I was like, I was like going down the rooms trying to find mine. And then you turn and then you see it and you're like, oh, whoa. I mean, that's to me, the places that are open, and we hope we can continue to keep them open and that they can continue to show work, because like I see them all close up like this, and to be able to walk into a room, whether it's virtually or not, and see it hanging there with other work around it with the big space. I always really appreciate that, even though I don't always get to go see them. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, you guys can learn more about Kathy and her website and check out her Instagram account as well to see more in process photos. And thank you so much for joining us, Kathy. We always love to see your work. And you can see the exhibit, it's up until January 10th. And thank you, Kathy.
Thank you guys.